There's all this emphasis in the wine world about getting the best the whole time. You know, is this the one with 97 points or has this only got 93 points? But you know, the 93-point wine or the 89-point wine can be absolutely delicious.
So.
I don't know how many points this has got and I don't give a shit. It's just gorgeous wine.
As simple as it may sound, but the fine wine has to be super drinkable. I mean, you know, if it's too intellectual, it requires, you know, a master of wine to understand it. Forget it.
Wine is a journey.
Yeah, journey.
We're all on a
Yeah,
journey.
yeah.
I'm still on a journey.
Yeah,
We're all
all
on a
on a
journey.
journey. Yeah, so.
And, you know, the definition
Yeah.
of fine wine will change during that journey.
I did consider it as a real feature in a wine, you know, if you could really smell shit in the glass. I mean, in a good way, but, you know, like not bad shit, but good shit.
So this wine is older than I am.
Oh, cheers.
Cheers.
Fine wine is always about having conversations with fine people. And I think that's what is happening tonight. So I'll try to propose a toast. Yeah. Cheers. Cheers. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. This is Agnes from No Sediment, and welcome to our show, Talk Under the Vine. Today, I have two esteemed and exciting guests, Aigars and Andrew.
Cheers.
Cheers. Hi.
Cheers.
Could maybe you a little bit introduce yourself and why we are here and why we are talking, why can we talk about wine?
Sure. Andrew, you want to start?
Okay, my name is Andrew Jefford. I'm a wine writer and educator and wine guide and various other things around wine, been that for the last 30 years. I'm fortunate enough to know Aigards because I've done a lot of work in Riga, and then through that I've got to know you, Agnes. And we're here to do some tasting work and competition work, and that's given us the opportunity to sit down and talk together, which is great.
It is great, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, it's a pleasure to know you too. Well, I'm the head and founder of Riga Wine and Champagne Festival, as you know well. So, we started, more than 10 years ago with the greatest champagne and bubble parade in the Baltic countries, and that's how we're still rolling. Also with the Wine of the Year competition, which helps people choose wines, which is co-chaired by Andrew Jefford and Michael Schuster, who couldn't be with us today. I'm doing all sorts of other big public tastings and things like this. Apart from this, I'm also a runner and a race director of Riga Marathon, but that's of no relevance to this show, I guess. But anyway, so I love wine and I love running, so that's sort of thing.
Perfect. And actually, so today I was inspired by this recent Institute of Masters of Wine exam question, and it sounded something like this. So what is the temporary definition of a fine wine and how it may have changed or evolved over the time? And as you two probably, especially you, I guess, know very well fine wine, I would like to know your opinions, and maybe we can talk about how it was defined maybe years ago or decades ago and how it has changed.
Sure. Actually, the funny thing is we talked about this topic in the last wine show we had in Riga, and it was you brought up some really interesting topics together with Michael Schuster then, and we tasted some really great wines. So I'm sure the good thing is that we're not just talking about these fine wines, but we're also going to be drinking some fine wines today. So Andrew, you want to start with your thoughts?
Sure. Well, you know, I guess 30 or 40 years ago, the wine world was a much smaller place. It was essentially European, and then it was always thought to have this top tier of what we call fine wine, which was long established. It was a hierarchy that had existed for many, many years. Everybody understood exactly what it meant, and principally it meant the European classics. It meant Burgundy, it meant Bordeaux, it meant great German wines, which have a distinguished history. Of course, it meant champagne too. And then it meant a few other wines, notably fortified wines like port and like sherry. And there was beginning to be some understanding of it, fine Italian wine at that point. Now, the wine world has exploded.
Yeah.
It's gone out in every direction. And I would say that, you know, when we talk about this question, we have to realize that we're talking about a continuum. It's not, in a year, it's not just summer and suddenly winter. There is spring and autumn too. And it's exactly like that with what fine wine might be. You start off with very simple wines, you end up with very complex wines, but there's everything along the way round. And I think so we have to accept that in the contemporary understanding or definition of fine wine, we're going to be somewhere along a continuum where we have to make decisions about what comes in and what goes out. And personally, I would always argue for complete liberalism. I would argue for a very flexible understanding of what fine wine might be. But let me hand over to Aigards at that point before I go on for too long.
I actually would agree with you, and specifically brought this book with me. It's one of the first editions of Jancis Robinson's Oxford's edition, and I looked up the definition of fine wine, which is here in this book, and it basically is a very simple one. It says, fine wine is a term used by the auction houses to describe the sort of wines they sell, which roughly coincide with those described as investment. So, for example, in Bordeaux, it would mean classed gross. That's it. That's about it. So wine which is sold, which is by the auction houses.
So the secondary market. So it has a value in the secondary market.
Yeah, absolutely. It would certainly imply that these wines are sold over auction houses. But the thing is, of course, I guess when this definition was formed, and also years ago, auction houses have changed completely. The scene of auction houses. It was predominantly like Sotheby's and Christie's in the old days. Now it's that scene has changed completely. And I also took with me the 1970s Christie's catalog, and you can see basically which were the wines that were selling at that time, and they were the ones you were just describing, And the main thing, of course, then was Bordeaux, of course, and still is. Bordeaux is, if you look at the main indexes like Livex, for instance, Livex 100 or Livex 1000, it constitutes probably half of the whole thing is comprised of Bordeaux. So Bordeaux still, is, the fine wine. And then everything else. So basically you could go through the content of this book, and that's it. Bordeaux, Burgundy, little bit of Rhone at that time, and no New World at all. So New World, like Australia, maybe with one producer, then Spain with one producer, we all know, and then Italy with a couple of producers in Piedmont and Tuscany, and Port, of course, and things like this. But it's been super narrow, and now do you actually need a definition of fine wine? I don't know. I mean,
I can offer another definition.
Okay.
Because one of the magazines I write for is called World of Fine Wine.
Yes, exactly.
So obviously a starting point when we launched the magazine under distinguished editor Dr. Neil Beckett, a great friend of mine, was to sort of ask all the contributors what fine wine might mean. And probably the most succinct definition was that provided by Hugh Johnson, who said it's a wine worth talking about. And I've always quite liked that definition, with the proviso that, of course, what wine isn't worth talking about, really? I mean, perhaps there are boring wines and there are bad wines, and you don't want to talk too much about those, although it's informative to talk about why bad wines are bad wines. But almost any wine, I think, even a simple wine, can be worth talking about. So I think that's a nice starting point to the liberal definition. But I still think we need to use other ways of looking at it as well.
I think you're very, very democratic, Andrew. Yes. Well, some simple wines are really not worth talking about. But for you, simple probably means a very different thing than simple in average market simple. Let's say.
Maybe. But I'm always wanting to come back to the individual experience of wine for everybody, for ordinary people. And we have access to lots of wonderful, sophisticated, subtle, complex wines, and those kind of adjectives would be the sort of adjectives I'd be looking for to try and define fine wine. And yet I'm very, aware of, having drunk wine with my parents, who are both now dead, for example, but who had no sort of particular wine culture, that wine could be something very precious and very exciting for them, even if it was very simple and straightforward. So I wouldn't want to, as it were, rob the ordinary drinker of the chance of feeling that they were drinking something very fine when they had a glass of relatively simple wine. And perhaps I'm almost anarchic in that sense, but I do feel it's very important that inclusivity plays a role here as well as exclusivity. I wouldn't want any definition of fine wine to be too exclusive, because I think that is false to everybody's experience of drinking wine.
Yeah, it's kind of like fine arts, and
Yeah.
which is very inclusive definition, by the way. Yeah, so I think we have to have everybody a chance to experience a fine wine. And let's hope that they actually, have a way to discover that the wine they're drinking is fine.
Yes.
Yes.
And a personal definition which might change with time as their wine journey extends.
Very much so. Yeah.
The definition that you mentioned from the 70s, Christie's, it must include that the wine has ability to develop and change over the years. And in many cases, when I have studied wine, it is one of the kind of pillars when you define good, high quality wine. And I always asked myself, is there a great wine that does not necessarily evolve with time in the bottle? And could we also define it as a great wine? And then I was thinking about some examples, and I would immediately go to Sancerre, but then all the wine professionals would say, no, great Sancerre can age. So then this is also a question that I often ask myself.
I don't think ageability has to be part of the definition. Condrieu is another one. If you talk to people who are really into Northern Rhone wines, Condrieu is a wine made from Viognier in the Northern Rhone. They will say that it ages, but actually I've never had an example that truly was as sensually enticing and as seductive as a beautiful young Condrieu. So I don't think ageability is necessary, but I just think we have to use lots and lots of definitions and always kind of relate it to the wine in our glass, really, when we had this discussion.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's a piece in the Drinking with the Valkyries book I published last year about Picpoul de Piny, where I sort of try and mount a case, but thinking about that as a fine wine. Why shouldn't we think about it as a fine wine? Because it's a subtle wine, can be a very subtle wine. Subtlety is part of the sort of thing that we're looking for. And it can also give you a sense of a place, a very strong sense of place. I think that's quite an important part of it too. It doesn't age. I wouldn't ever age it. So that's not a factor. Not an auction wine necessarily. Not an expensive wine either. And yet I know from having drunk that wine under many different circumstances that it can procure really a sort of profound pleasure, a sort of exquisite sense of really tasting something that comes from a place and is very powerful and persuasive and beautiful. And gives you an understanding of the place through the drink. And to me, that would be the kind of way I would also wish to define a fine wine. So I would say that wine can be a fine wine, even though that wine would never normally be accepted into the pantheon of fine wines.
But wouldn't you think that ageability sort of increases the chances of a wine to automatically become a fine wine, because it gives so many more stories to it, and you can compare how this wine tasted in this vintage, that was a crap vintage, or that was a great vintage. It kind of extends the shelf life, let's say, of a fine wine.
I would accept that.
The ageability. But also, I think, and you touch a very important point regarding Picpoul. Many of the wines, of fine wines, which were considered, which were considered fine wines, and which are now considered fine wines, you were supposed to drink them mature, like old, mature. That's really a feature of fine wine. But now I find a lot of wines, on fine wines, I can drink them young, and I can enjoy them young. We were talking earlier, about I know your love story with young ports.
Yes.
I have a love story with young Barolos, for instance, which I don't really want to even age for as long as they were aged, some time ago, like 20, 30 years ago. But now it's I love 2016s and 13s and sort of young wines. So from that sense, as ageability, yes, that's one thing, but also fine wine has to be also enjoyed young.
So I think we're getting close to a definition that says a fine wine is the wine for which you can mount a convincing argument for it to be one.
Okay, I like that. But then again, it depends who's arguing, right? Who's defining it.
Yeah.
You mentioned terroir, that it kind of expresses, not necessarily terroir, but expresses the place. And I think that nowadays we talk a lot that, at least I believe, or want to believe, that fine wine should be able to express its terroir. And it means that the owner of the terroir or winemaker should be or go towards and save that terroir and kind of be able or make sure that this terroir delivers the same quality every year after year, like after 10 years and after 20 years?
Yeah, I think it is a very valid point, and I absolutely agree that the fine wine should express the terroir. But at the same time, one aspect of a definition of a fine wine, I think, that has changed, and maybe you disagree with me, but it is that producer has become probably even in some sense even more important than the terroir. Yes, it is terroir. Of course, we all want to drink wines of terroir, but you know, in some regions you would say, if that wine is produced by that guy, yes, it's a fine wine. If it's produced by somebody else, forget it. Yeah, you know, it happens. You know, like.
But that's because the other person isn't capable, they're not adequately skillful enough in the vineyard and the winery to deliver a wine which can give you this link to place.
Expression of terroir, yes.
In the way that the wine or the good person does, or the top person.
Yeah, so,
But I like this idea of a link to a place on earth, which is one of the most exciting things wine does for us in general. That's why, I always say that one of the reasons why we love wine is because it bonds us to our home planet. It bonds us to our place on earth.
A dream.
It enables us to take a place on earth into our bodies and to feel that place on earth is going into our bodies. A very unique, strange, and extraordinary experience. And I think if a wine can really do that well, and many wines don't do it at all, but if a wine can do that well, then it mounts a good case for being a fine wine.
But then again, let's be honest, there are many great expensive wines, and we can also touch upon the subject whether or not price makes a difference for a fine wine. Great wines that not necessarily expresses their terroir, and still people, I think, love it. They buy it, and I know that, for example, definitely some of the commentators on my YouTube channel, they for example, not necessarily love all the super Tuscans, because there's like, why would you grow Cabernet Sauvignon in the Tuscany? And then, it's like many different questions. And in Australia, for example, when you do the multi-regional blends, and one of the most expensive wines, Grange, and that is multi-regional.
And Grange is still considered the only Australian fine wine by some of the auction houses, let's say, but which is of course funny, but there's so many great wines in Australia.
But it is South Australian nonetheless, so it's
Southern
some
Australia,
kind of sense of origin.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe not the smallest.
Yeah.
So then again, good question. So how small should be the terroir? How, do we say that terroir is Australia or South Australia?
Well, again, with my sort of fundamentally liberal outlook, I would argue for a relatively, some wines, obviously, in the case of Burgundy, people are looking for a very, very precise single vineyard expression of terroir. But I do also think that, again, further down the price chain, for the wines that most people will have access to most of the time, nonetheless, if you have a sense of a wine being Australian as opposed to Californian, or French, come to that, or Spanish, these things all mean something to us, then that's still a print of terroir to some extent, bearing in mind that terroir doesn't just mean the soil, it also means the culture in which the wine comes into being. And there is a sense of origin to those, to wines of that sort. And so, again, I'm not saying that's necessarily a way of defining a fine wine, because at that level, probably it isn't. It's, we're talking about everyday wines which people can enjoy. But I do think that you can nonetheless have a much larger definition of terroir as well as a very small definition of terroir.
Yeah, and I think it's super important that is the reason why we write the address of the place on the label. So basically, as soon as you put it on the table and you see something written on it, at least, and anybody who's been reading about wine, who's been listening to stories, etc., he should have at least a direction of idea. Let's say, okay, this wine is going to be tasting, like this. So it's going to be fresh, or it's going to be opulent, or it's going to be, whatever the message the label gives you. So if you cannot achieve that sort of thing, probably you can't talk about fine wines. Then, So this, as soon as you put it on the table, that should be a statement. If not, maybe that's something else. And yeah.
Well, I will tell a story. Maybe it does not put me in the greatest position as a wine taster, but I did a tasting, and I was studying for my master of wine exam, and so we had 4 sparkling wines. I knew that they were all traditional method, and I knew that one of them was champagne. I missed every single one. So I mentioned Kent as a British sparkling wine, English sparkling wine. I mentioned California. I mentioned champagne, and I mentioned Franciacorta, but they were all over the place. So
that's why the exams don't make any sense.
yeah, no, I was just studying. So good that I failed on that mock exam. Let's call it that. But I mean, Californian sparkling, like the producers who make Californian sparkling wine, they're trying to replicate what they are making in Champagne. They're looking for terroirs a bit cooler, and then Champagne region maybe is embracing the a bit kind of warmer climate right now and the riper style. And I hear a lot of winemakers are harvesting later and later their grapes. So there's a bit of
Yeah. Things
Mix.
are changing all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And what Andrew was saying in the beginning, I think even the terroir messages of all the major regions, and not just major regions, also the upcoming regions, their messages are changing. They're evolving all the time. And the funny thing is, you did it blind. You tasted the wines blind. So and it's probably not the best, not the most informative way to learn. It's when you put the tables on the bottles on the table, and you see the labels, and you see, okay, well, this is very interesting to see how let's say the British sparklers have evolved over the time. My definition of their terroir was wrong, maybe. So that is why, again, it is super interesting to see how it changes over time. You can check whether your knowledge is up to date, for instance. Yeah. So and for Champagne, the same thing. There may be so many different little micro terroirs, so also different winemaking techniques from ranging from one winemaker to another, from one grower to another. So blind tasting in that context is super difficult. Yeah.
Speaking of which,
yes.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of which,
so Aigards has brought us a wine, which we don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's a region everybody would consider the fine wine region. So it had to have some sort of a context to this conversation, of course. And like we discussed before, you don't have to guess the identity, but maybe we can
talk about it.
Yeah, we can talk about it. Yeah. So I'm almost finished on mine, so I'm not sure what you're waiting for. So.
We were waiting for the excuse to start tucking in and enjoying it, because there's an awful lot to enjoy. Actually, it's a beautiful wine, beautiful sparkling wine. Yeah. Very fine bubbles, all the things that you look for technically. But actually, when you have it in the mouth, it has this wonderful core of ripe acidity. And to me, this is the sort of the hallmark of the northern model of sparkling wines, Champagne being the great example of that. Where it's built around a core of acidity, which seems to work so well for sparkling wine, and yet at the same time, although the acidity is very prominent, it's absolutely saturated with flavor and aroma. It's the acidity is pregnant with all these other things, in a way that if you just take an acidity out of a bag and spooned it into your sparkling wine base, it wouldn't be pregnant with all those other things. That's the lovely thing about this wine. It's very structured around its acidity. It's quite dry. It's not a particularly creamy style of sparkling wine or champagne, but it just has this purity and this articulacy orchestrated around this wonderful core of acidity. So on a hot evening in Riga, I'm super enjoying it, and it's very fine.
I'm glad to hear. Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you, whether you think it's fine, but
I do think it's fine. What about you, Agnes?
After all this poetry that you just described, this wine, it's very difficult to kind of pitch in. But while we were talking and discussing, I was thinking about particularly the structure of this wine. I thought that the the bubbles, the mousse, it was not even bubbles. It was really kind of like this...
sort of
like
caressing the tongue.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful, kind of, and sitting and kind of teasing you a little bit. I mean, not being in any way, kind of sparkly or just kind of creamy bubble way.
Yeah.
Like I really like that structure. And one thing that I learned in my school is they usually say structure never lies, and I thought that this was very fine kind of driven. And you mentioned purity, and I thought that this was perfect.
Beautiful comments. Thank you.
It's not one where it's been. You don't sense a lot of winery in this. A lot of using the lees and making it all creamy, and which can be lovely as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that can be gorgeous. But this is so pure and so much. This is a direct line to the vineyard almost. It's. I mean, of course, this is one of the fascinating things about wine. That why is it when you taste grape juice, it is so disappointing, and then you taste wine and it's so exciting. The fermentative metamorphosis is incredibly important with wine. That's, wine only comes into being when juice is fermented. And I think we tend to sort of almost overlook this fermentative metamorphosis. But this is a wine where you could almost have a sort of direct line to the fresh fruit in the way that you can with many German wines, which are also very fine too. So in a way, it's a sort of a simplicity of approach, and yet there's so much rightness and so much resonance and so much, as I said, articulacy connected with the delivery of that it's incontrovertibly fine.
Yeah, and this brings up a couple of points, I think, and the way you mentioned how it's linked to its terroir, and it is actually. And a good friend of mine, Peter Liam, you've had an interview with him too. He always says in Champagne, well, this is Champagne anyway. So in Champagne, you should not ask what sort of grape variety it is, but you should ask where it's coming from. So I think, it's easy for me to talk because I know what the wine is, but I think it tells very well where it's coming from, and not just the region in general, but also as a sub-region where it's coming from. Yeah, so I think it's, in that sense, it's absolutely magic how it translates the message in the glass. Yeah, so yeah, and of course the other argument I was talking about earlier, as a producer, that grower, he does some magic here too. So. And that's very important.
Well, that's that's another interesting thing. You say it's a grower, and I mean, I was thinking it probably was a grower because of that purity of line, which you wouldn't really ever get with a blended champagne, because the moment you start to blend lots of different things in, you create something fantastic, which is layered and complex and like a tapestry or the carpet in front of us, something like that. But this is so simple. It's it's more like a monochrome color or a pure flute note or something like that just comes singing out of the glass, but it really speaks of its place and the season and the purity of everything everything one could wish for, really. So it's a perfect example of a fine wine which can be very, at its heart, very pure and simple as well.
Yeah. And actually, it brings me to another point. We've been talking about fine wine. We mentioned terroir, we mentioned producers, etc. But we also mentioned vintages, and this comes from a very particular vintage, because especially now, when we talk about climate change, etc. So, in Champagne, this vintage is the last one in this century where harvest actually took in October. Yeah. So
oh wow.
So it gives you a little bit of hint of why you can feel the ripeness here. So
yeah, and this of course is why actually champagne producers are so worried about the changes that the climate is undergoing at the moment, because it is so interesting at the same time as being so simple, because of that length of season, that teasing gradually, slowly, day after day after day towards a final ripeness. And of course, if it hurries towards ripeness, you don't get that same
sensuality. Yes.
Yeah, or of complexity bound up in simplicity, a sort of an object which is full of detail at the same time as being a simple object.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to be torturing you anymore, but it is a Pascal Agripart, 2013 Avisoise. So basically, probably one of the champagnes, my favorite growers, certainly. So, because coming from Avisoise, from Avis, and his champagnes, well, this particular one is coming from very clay soils.
Yeah.
And it's aged under cork, as you can see, and his wines are just magic.
Beautiful wine.
And you can see the dosage here is 3 grams, but the wine feels so ripe and so beautiful. So it's so it goes a fine wine. Well, of course, you will not find. I checked once again the Livex list of the champagnes, what they have on the list. Of course, they have the big guns, Dom Perignon and Krug and Cristal, of course. But from grower side, they only have Aigards and Solos, of course. Yeah. But this is that same quality easily. Yeah. So this is another point that of course the definition of fine wine is so much evolving, and any index cannot possibly keep up with it. So
if we come back to the definition you mentioned in the beginning about the secondary market, like the value in the secondary market, we have to have enough wine so that there is something that we can sell in the secondary market. So it kind of requires for it to be produced in a certain volume. But nowadays maybe we think that, the smaller estates are more capable of expressing its terroir and maybe are more unique, something more to talk about. So what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think if you look at the Burgundy example, La Romanée, which is this tiny, tiny vineyard in Romanée, nobody would say it wasn't a fine wine. So it's certainly in the fine wine pantheon, even though of all the people that talk about it, maybe 1% have ever tasted it. So that's a sort of paradox. I do think that, the great advantage of, for example, Bordeaux first growth or the Bordeaux top wines is that they are, in most cases, produced in quantities large enough for most people at some stage or another, somehow or another, to have had access to tasting those wines, maybe through a wine club, maybe by going to a tasting event, something like that, even if it's not actually owning a bottle. Whereas super tiny production Burgundies, most people will never even have access to. Romanée Conti, who's actually going to taste Romanée Conti? Maybe we've tasted it once or twice because in 30 years I've had access to the opportunity to do that, but most people will never have that chance. So it becomes slightly sort of a theoretical concept at that point. It would be interesting maybe at this point to make some analogy with fine art or with literature or with great architecture or with the artistic sphere. Because I suppose, we're always looking for the most exquisite experiences in each of these things. Whatever music we like, we're looking for the most exquisite experience. Ditto for paintings, ditto for literature. But all of these things can have a wonderful accessibility nowadays with recorded music. This is a big problem with wine.
Absolutely.
It's a big problem with
wine. It's a crazy
problem. To have access to the very finest wines, you need to be in a small circle of ultra-wealthy people. And I think we have to talk about this, because to me this is an enormous drawback. There's an essay again about this in the Valkyrie's book called, I won't go on about the essay, but there's an essay about that. And it's something that troubles me enormously, to the extent that I often feel almost guilty about writing about some of the most exquisite fine wines, because I know that the circle of access to those wines will be very limited.
It's funny that you say it, and that's why I asked in the beginning, does the definition of fine wine actually matter to anybody? I mean, it might matter to, small circle of wine geeks and wine lovers, etc., who occasionally drinks these wines. But that's why it's super important that thank God, the definition of fine wine has evolved, and we can call so many more things as fine wines, because otherwise, if we're sticking to the things which are mentioned in this book, probably this younger generation will never have a chance to taste these wines, because some of the super rare Burgundies, forget it. Yeah. But back to your original point about whether the fact that the wine is available freely, makes it somehow more accessible as a fine wine. Absolutely, and that's why I think that for many people, Bordeaux is still the entry point, into the world of fine wine, because it is probably the only big fine wine region where you can easily track down old vintages easily. I'm talking easily, like really in auctions and internet stores, etc. All over Europe, you can find great vintages for under reasonably accessible money, now if you talk, super cult growers, whether it's Champagne, whether it's, in Burgundy, forget it. It's impossible. It's then you have to be in the circle, or have to have, friends with super great cellars or deep pockets. Yeah. So in that sense, Bordeaux still makes a lot of really great sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway.
So there's a wine number 2, I guess.
Wine number 2.
Fine wine number 2.
Right. Let's check this out. There's a specific reason why I chose this.
Nice.
Yeah. I'll and probably along the way I will reveal part of its identity, but it doesn't matter that much. It comes from a country which I value dearly, and which is probably not amongst the initial circles of fine wine circles. Let's say wines of this grape are like commonplace among fine wines, but this particular one is coming from a different country, so it's not France.
Yeah.
Just to tell you, yeah. So you wouldn't probably find this wine in any official classification. You wouldn't probably in that country, but other than that, it's probably it's not included in any fine wine indexes. But it is fine. Absolutely, the finest expression of fine wine you could find of this grape, but not in France. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so I'm hoping I'm making some sense.
Yeah. No,
You're making sense to me.
Yes.
And I'm super interested to hear this, because I probably would have guessed this was a white Burgundy, and it's not. You're now telling us it's not at all.
It's not.
Yeah. So, well,
that's why it's interesting for me to serve something which is modeled as a white Burgundy, but it's not. Yeah. So supposedly, by the old definition, it's nowhere near fine wine.
Yeah.
But according to the new definition, which we just defined, it's absolutely a fine wine. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was so interesting, because we talked about, these definitions of fine wine, and then you said specifically, you said, this is absolutely fine wine. And I think we kind of forget to talk about the actual quality of the wine in the glass, the length, the concentration, what are these parameters, if you will, that we look for in a fine wine. We mentioned maybe a little bit the ageability or aging potential, but also
it's really a question of the style of sort and style of pleasure that it brings. I mean, many wines bring pleasure, but a wine like this, we mentioned a little earlier the idea of subtlety, for example. This is a very subtle wine. It's not an obvious wine at all. It's not super flamboyant on the nose. It has a beautiful aroma, but it doesn't come out and hit you. You need to wander into the glass and spend a bit of time with it and get all that sort of subtle, fine, cool fruit, slightly mushroomy, cut mushroom, something like that. Things like that, which are just very slowly coming off the wine. And then ditto on the palate, actually. The palate follows the aromas very exactly. You get that lovely incision of it that it has. Again, acidity not as prominent now as it would have been on the Champagne, of course, but very articulate, richly architectural acidity filling the mouth.
Architectural acidity.
And those aromas beginning to come off it. But it does all of these things very subtly. It doesn't do it obviously at all. And I think subtlety and finesse and complexity in that sense is often something that we need to bring into play when we talk about fine wine, or we attempt to talk about fine wine.
Yeah, and we often attribute these features to just certain regions of the world, because that's the way we were taught, that's the way we're built, and that's the way we taste and drink, etc. But it's very rarely is that. That's why I think it's important to serve these sort of wines blind, to not to identify them, but to realize that all these beautiful things which you just described can come, from pretty much a lot of places in the world.
That's right. So, started by saying the wine world has exploded, and it really has.
Yeah.
And there is a good case to be said now for almost every wine-producing country has a fine wine category. The the knowledge about how to grow vineyards in an optimum way and how to craft limpid wine that can reveal itself without a lot of winery work is now uniform across the wine world, which means that almost every wine country now has the potential to produce a category of wine which, like this, is very subtle and very fine and can bring you really profound satisfaction.
And among the things that Andrew mentioned, you asked, what are some of the qualities we're looking for? I always look, as simple as it may sound, but the fine wine has to be super drinkable. If it's too intellectual, if it requires, a master wine to understand it, forget it. It can't be. It has to be something that you really want to, chew and grab it by the leg and
keep sipping. Keep
sipping.
Wanting to. I'm finding it very hard to stop going back to this glass the whole time because it's so delicious. I want to keep sipping it. This is a very good sign that we're onto a fine wine.
Because otherwise, it's just an intellectual exercise, and then it's it's not fun. It's not.
And actually, it's surprising. How often when one spends a lot of time with wine geeks, you end up drinking a lot of wines which. Okay, I know I'm meant to like this, but sorry, I can't quite get to like it because it's just too difficult and intellectual and austere and not giving enough. I think, the inner generosity, however expressed, many different ways of expressing that, but that's quite important. Even the champagne with its wonderfully pure fruit line from this rather difficult, chilly year of 2013 had an inner generosity that came from respecting the length of the season. Waiting until the wine was perfectly right.
Absolutely. Should we reveal what the wine is or no?
We can reveal. It depends. Really, do you want to torture us a bit more and kind of guess?
Go ahead because we still have two wines, I guess.
Yeah.
Is it coming from New Zealand by any chance or not?
You're very close.
I was thinking
that is the same direction. But it's Australia.
Okay.
And their website says fine wines since 1985.
Oh wow.
Yes. Well, that's a long time for Australia.
Wow. Sure. Like this wine shows that pristine fruit. It's I as well, like you thought in the beginning that it was like Burgundy, and then you mentioned, and then when you kind of taste it and smell it, it has that kind really clean, really pure, pristine, crystalline almost fruit style.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you did not know this was Australia, then you said you would go to Burgundy probably.
Well, my initial thought was, for sure Burgundy, because also, it is, with this grape variety Chardonnay, it's a relatively sort of lean incarnation. And of course, nowadays in Burgundy, many Margaux, forget all the buttery, nutty stuff of 20 years ago. They're quite lean and muscular and athletic in a way that they never used to be. And this wine sort of has that. So that was kind of my first line of thought. And then when I sipped it a bit more and you told us it wasn't from there, I was thinking, oh gosh, at the end of the palate with the fruit, there's something just a little bit tropical there, something that suggests a slightly sort of warmer climate, even though the wine itself is very controlled and cool. And that was what made me head off to New Zealand. And now you've taken us to Australia, so that's great. We've been on a journey, which is a lovely thing to do with wine.
Australian Chardonnay was a big, like a revelation to me. But when I visited that region more than 10 years ago, together with Tim Wildman.
Tim Wildman.
Yeah, he is a great Australian man, and I think he's turned many European drinkers into Australian fans. So we visited so many grape growers with fantastic Chardonnays. So since then, I've been a fan of Australian Chardonnay. Unfortunately, we did not visit this particular winery, but this was the one I could get a couple of years ago from another Australian master wine, Justin Nock in London. So this is
best friend of Tim Wellman, I guess.
So this has been in my cellar for maybe 6-7 years now.
Oh, thank you for sharing it.
Oh yeah, you're well welcome. Yeah. And I bought it. It just brings another interesting point in fine wine. Australian wine can appreciate in value a lot because I bought it, for less than €100. Now, if you check Wine Searcher, it's $250.
Oh wow,
it's crazy. Yeah. So anyway, so it's Giaconda.
I was going to say, I wrote to Rick Kinsborough this afternoon because I should have worked this out. I saw his face on your computer screen.
Oh, okay.
And it reminded me that he'd written to me earlier in the summer because he comes and spends summer in Europe.
All right.
And, we were going to get together and suddenly I realized, forgotten to write back to Rick. So I shouldn't guess this was Giaconda, but anyway.
Cheers.
What a treat.
Agnes.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
It's amazing.
Okay, so it's Giaconda.
Yeah.
I want to circle back a little bit to what you said about the wine geeks and that wine should bring pleasure. Nowadays, there is this huge popularity amongst the low intervention natural wines. And I realized, and it might be controversial to some and some might not like it, but I realized that I want my wine to be clean. And I will quote woman actually, who I really want to get to interview, Monica Christman, the professor at Geisenheim University. And she said that it is surprising how many actually really quite expensive premium wines nowadays have huge levels of histamine, biogenic amines, like all these like low intervention wines. And I thought fine wine, and it's funny that we have to talk about it right now, but fine wine should also be clean and pure in terms of how it is made. And lately, I think that we kind of maybe start to value a bit of that funkiness and we maybe don't mind it. So what are your thoughts on it? Am I just this kind of really old school person talking?
I suspect Aigars can speak for himself, but I suspect we both know where you're coming from. Because in the early days of the natural wine movement, there were many horrible wines, truly horrible wines, foisted on the market under the excuse that they were natural, which were really difficult for anybody who, certainly had any kind of, length of experience with wine to drink. They weren't necessarily horrible for people who had no experience of wine because they didn't know what to expect. And it was kind of chaotic and fun and funky and cool and sexy and all the other things, and that was great. But I think actually the natural wine movement has brought an awful lot to the world of wine generally. And what you're alluding to, I think, Agnes, is the fact that it's helping us expand our horizons about what is beautiful in wine. I've just been, last week I was in Georgia, for example. When you taste a Kvevri wine, a beautifully made Kvevri wine, you will taste things that are kind of completely outside the repertoire of fine wine as we knew it up until 10 years ago, let's say. Because the whole fermentative metamorphosis, as I called it a bit earlier, is taken even further there, because the whole, in the case of white wine, the whole bunch is going in, often the stems are going in, spending an awful lot of time with those things, spending an awful lot of time with the product of lees, sealed up for 6 months with all of that stuff in there. You're going to get a kind of burden of flavor and aroma which you would never, ever have got in a correctly made white Burgundy or a correctly made Riesling from Germany. And yet those things are beautiful, and we now realize they are beautiful. Yeah. Our horizons have expanded and altered. And I think, we have a lot to thank the natural wine world for having made us, taken us there, taken us on that journey, because it's going to expand the possibilities of pleasure that we can take in wine. So in the end, I think, despite all the manifold failings that we had along the way, all the accidents and the disasters and the car crashes, and the plane crashes and the volcanoes and the earthquakes and all the other stuff, the crevasses we fell into, in the end we got to a better place, which is a broader aesthetic spectrum being possible within even, the fine wine definition.
Yeah, I would agree. I would be very cautious of entertaining the thought that only the fine wines have to be clean or because first of all it's defined what is clean. Yeah. Sometimes, and not just sometimes, these differences and might lead you to something very, very interesting. In something what you were just talking about, like discovering in Georgian wines. Yeah. So I would be very careful of trying to impose that cleanliness as a super feature of a fine wine. Yeah, some of them are very clean, but at the same time, let's say, I don't know, Anselm Celos champagne. Would you describe that style as clean? I'm not sure, but I love the wines, and the champagne community loves the wines. But certain critics would say, no, that's not the way champagne should be made. But who cares? They're super drinkable. They're great representatives of champagne terroir. So I think that's an example where you should be careful. This maybe what you meant with clean is in a good way. But
I did not mean that the clean wine as a
that's what I'm saying. It's probably
I think the question you have to ask is there the possibility for expressive width within what the wine is expressing? If it's monotonous, if it cannot do anything except be what it is, if it's sort of fixed in one place, which is what faults tend to give you. If you have a corky wine, all you can smell is the smell of TCA. There's no two ways about that. Yeah. So if a wine made in that style, I mean, the classic is really oxidation. If it's chronically oxidized, so all that you can smell is this very monotonous oxidation, and you can't get beyond that, and there's no expressive width at all in the wine, then I think it's a failed wine. But what we're realizing now is that some of these wines made in this style will surprise us at first. We'll find things in them that we never used to find in fine wines, but they're not monotonous. They have an expressive power,
adventurous,
which can bring us extra pleasure, and that's great. That's fantastic. That's what we're looking for.
This actually
and it's all about pleasure, after all.
Of course, yes. This we have established, but this also brings us to at least myself. I often think about. I like wine, and I like things and people and art where there's maybe something. It's difficult for me to express this in English, but there's some, not necessarily error, but not specifically
something troubling.
Troubling maybe, or itching. Like with the champagne, you have to have imperfect glass for bubbles to kind of be created in it. And maybe it's not perfect symmetry or something. That's I've realized that this is beauty for me.
Well, the Japanese understand this concept very well. That's part of their aesthetic. That if anything is too perfect, is not perfect. There has to be an imperfection for something really to be perfect.
Exactly.
That's what I meant.
So my idea of pure or clean wine was not to be for the perfect, but rather than how much do we kind of allow. I mean, there was a time when we all loved Brettanomyces, and we kind of embraced
I still love it.
and you still love it, so that's also kind of great question and part.
In certain amounts.
And I think increasingly more nowadays, wine critics.
Well, I mean, oxidation is a good example. Controlled oxidation. Oxidation as a complexing factor, classically, as in Jura wines, can bring enormous levels of complexity. And with older champagnes as well, absolutely. Or oak age base wines and champagne. Yeah.
So we are on the same page.
Yeah, we are on the same page. Yeah. We have cleared the table a little bit. There's a lot of wine for us.
That's the best way to talk, with wine.
Yeah.
About fine wine.
Yeah.
Well, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I think we were talking about whether or not clean or clear wine, and then we moved to the Brettanomyces. Yeah, that you actually.
I still like it there.
Yeah.
Especially in older wines. Yeah. I can sometimes consider that as a nice feature of older aged, mature wines. Especially for maybe an immature wine culture as we are. I did consider it as a real feature in a wine. If you could really smell shit in the glass. I mean, in a good way, but not bad shit, but good shit.
Yeah.
So
there's an interesting question here. Can you over-educate your palate? Can you become too refined?
Yes.
That your aesthetic parameters are so narrow you don't really enjoy anything because it can never be perfect.
Yeah.
I think this can happen, actually.
This can happen.
I've had this conversation several times with other wine people, and I would almost say I work hard to avoid that. I try never to look at alcohol, because it's stupid. It preconditions you to sort of discover alcohol or not or whatever and think about it about a wine in a certain way. I try, not to pay too much attention to grape varieties, because actually to me, it's really the place that is the most interesting thing. And I think we focus far too much on grape varieties, and they condition our thinking as well. I try not to worry too much about the hierarchy of origins that we're all meant to respect the whole time. I just try and be as open as possible, and that's really the way to maximize your pleasure in wine, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, like maybe something that we consider, if we just purely talk about fine wine, I don't know, in its quality, and I guess we are, for someone, what we consider a fine wine might be not necessarily the best. Yeah, and you often hear from people who are not like everyday wine drinkers, not necessarily educated palates, or just kind of enjoy wine. They say, oh no, this is not for my palate. I don't understand it. We love it. We would talk about it for hours and hours. And they maybe, for example, the champagne, maybe it would be too acidity driven, or, for a certain person.
Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point, actually. Sometimes I think it should depend from culture to culture. If you've grown up with wine, then you would probably see some things or some of the fine wines differently than if you have been just thrown in it. Like when I consider our culture, like Latvian culture, we really had to grow up. We had to dig from the scratch, from the very beginning, from the bottom up. So in order to understand, good wines or fine wines, I had to drink a lot of Australian, €5 Shirazes, and I did drink that, and I loved them at that time. I always love these stories, when somebody like Giaconda would tell me, how he discovered, fine wine by a relative of his bringing this precious bottle from the cellars of his grandfather or something, and then then this Cheval Blanc 1947, suddenly opening the world to people. For us, I don't think it could happen, because, we would not be ready for it. You'd have to, climb up to understand, what that wine is, to drink up to that wine.
Wine is a journey.
Yeah, journey.
We're all on a journey. I'm still on a journey.
Yeah,
we're all
on a
we're
journey.
all.
Yeah, so.
And, the definition of fine wine will change during that journey, unquestionably. There were wines I used to love, which I can't stand anymore. Notably oaky wines. I used to really enjoy oaky wines, and now I struggle to find pleasure in any wine where you can see oak aromatically or on the palate.
No.
I find it a little disappointing nowadays. So my pantheon of what's fine has changed, but that's perfectly natural. That's to be expected as you go along your wine journey.
Yeah. So yeah, it can change quite a lot, along the way. Yeah.
Okay, so we were drinking fine wine number 3.
Well, to start us off, we mentioned drinkability actually with the last wine, and the moment you sip this wine, the balance of its components, there is some tannin there, there is some fruit there, now it's modulated, there is some acidity there, but it's again that very ripe acidity that has the whole season's fruit in it. And all of these things are so perfectly articulated amongst themselves that the wine just slips down so easily. It doesn't burn, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't sting you later on. And even the aftertaste, the way the aftertaste works, is this super soft melting into the palate, which is really a hallmark of, I think, fine wine. That is what is happening with this wine. Actually, you can tell that this wine has had some oak, I think, and it's been oaked. But again, it's not an obvious thing. The oak has melted into the wine, which is really what should happen with a wine which receives oak in its youth as it ages.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'm enjoying about this wine is it's super drinkable.
Oh, cheers for that.
Yeah.
Agnes, what do you think?
No, I was actually thinking about the ageability here, because I think this one shows a bit of age. It shows that tertiary complexity, like next to that fruit and oak that you mentioned before, and I think it kind of is layered and complex in that way. And we are coming back to the very beginning where we talked about whether or not
yes,
fine wine is a wine that can age.
I mean, I sense that this was a wine which was probably quite sturdy and structured in its youth. So this is definitely a wine that, again, we mentioned as another of the sort of elements the toolkit that we could use to talk about fine wine is the ageability thing. And this is clearly a wine that's already aged beautifully and has probably still got a way to go as well. It's not fading at all. It's not any sense of it being elderly or on its last leg.
Yeah.
Still has vitality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You both brought super points. And actually it is, with this wine, we went through the whole circle and we're returning back to where the fine wine definitions, the original fine wine definition originated. So you can probably understand from my comments where we're heading with this. But so it is a mature, classic fine wine.
And another interesting thing about this wine, and this is, I think, characteristic of the region it comes from, is, and you spoke a little earlier about things shouldn't be too perfect, okay? So it's easy to make a very sort of sweet, voluptuous, seductive wine with techniques in the winery. But the wonderful thing about wines from this region is they always have sort of 15% of something that's a bit austere in them, just to provide that refreshment element, to balance out with the riper elements in the wine. And that's another thing that makes them so kind of irresistibly attractive, I think. There's always that slight sense of a little cragginess or a little austerity or a little authority or a little sobriety or seriousness behind that adds zest to the pleasure. Whereas if it was pure pleasure, and there are lovely wines which are pure pleasure. I mean, Napa Valley Cabernet comes to mind, but this is not like that. There is a sort of that refreshing edge of slight difficulty and austerity.
Yeah, it kind of never really tells you its secrets, entirely. So it's there. Yeah, and another feature of this wine is when you get to the wines of this region, and I can tell you it's Bordeaux. Yeah, so it's it opens like a whole new horizon of stories when you start talking about vintages, and if you can talk about vintages, that's, definitely, a super feature of a fine wine, because, people can start fights, regarding vintages and which vintage turned out better for which chateau, etc., etc. So, and there is an interesting point why I'm telling this, that this is supposedly from a super famous Bordeaux vintage. And then you might recognize it, you might not, because in this vintage, this particular chateau probably did not do the best job, but it still turned out a very, very decent wine, as you see, and but it's
because it did the job from the soil it has, which is really quite good soil.
That's exactly
quite good.
Yeah, so in fine wines, sometimes even if you're not up to the job, the terroir will do its job.
Absolutely, and this is another thing that we should make with some emphasis. There's all this emphasis in the wine world about getting the best the whole time. Is this the one with 97 points, or has this only got 93 points? But the 93-point wine or the 89-point wine can be absolutely delicious. I don't know how many points this has got, and I don't give a shit. It's just gorgeous wine. It's delicious wine. It's served at the beautiful glasses at the right temperature among friends. And it really communicates all the things that we just talked about, this region, Bordeaux, can communicate so well.
And thank you for bringing this up. And there was one thing I remembered. Fine wine is always about having conversations with fine people. And I think that's what is happening tonight. So I'll try to propose a toast. Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
So thank you. Anyway, so
thank you for sharing this with
absolutely.
us.
I'm very happy to. You don't have to guess what it is, but it is Bordeaux, and it is a chateau I visited just recently, and it's Chateau Palmer.
Gosh.
So Margaux, and I loved my visit to Palmer for reasons I was telling you earlier. It's a complete breath of fresh air in Latin Bank at the moment. With Thomas Duro doing the fantastic job since 2004 as a main winemaker. Yeah, but this was produced long before Thomas Duro was even in winemaking. So so anyway, this is coming, like I said, from a super famous vintage. So it's 1982. Yeah. So,
good heaven.
Yeah.
82.
So 82. Yes.
Gosh, I've never tried this wine.
It's
lovely.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
So this wine is older than I am.
Oh, cheers.
Cheers.
Let's talk about You know?
This wine is not old.
Yeah, no,
But it's lovely. It's beautiful.
And it just, I mean, as you mentioned, it's not an oldie at all. Like
No.
it's
I'm surprised. I would not have guessed it was
holds
82
itself
actually.
so well.
yeah,
So
probably.
well.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of Bordeaux. We usually say that, at least I think, Bordeaux always seems, or fine Bordeaux, always seems younger in the glass than it actually is.
Yeah, it is true. Especially with old vintages, you can always get, so wrong.
Yeah.
And well, we've spoken about the ability to change and mutate with time as being one of the hallmarks of fine wine, not the only one. No region has that better than Bordeaux. No region ages more predictably, and no region's wines, I should say, really can increase in beauty to the same extent that the great red Bordeaux can with time. This is something almost miraculous, I think.
It is miraculous, yeah.
It's not true of Burgundy, actually. It's not true of the great Italian wines to the same extent. Not necessarily true of Rhone wines, although it can be true of Rhone wines sometimes. But with Bordeaux, it's hallmark, which is, I guess, why people, have this fetish of aging it to the extent that they do, because they know it's worthwhile. And by the way, listeners, readers, viewers, it's worth aging even modest Bordeaux for 10 years. It can age beautifully, and you can have such pleasure.
Yeah.
You have somewhere appropriate to store the wine. Really worth. And then a modest Bordeaux can be fine wine, no question.
No question at all. No.
I have some bottles of Chateau, a Cru Bourgeois, 2003, very hot vintage. I've just enjoyed those wines as they age so much, aging beautifully slowly, and it's just completely gorgeous wine, no question, but it's fine wine in my pantheon. It's not a perfect wine, and if I had to give it a score, it probably wouldn't be, a super lustrous score, but it's just gorgeous. Pleasure again, back to pleasure.
Back to pleasure.
Yeah. Cheers.
So have we decided on a definition? So the fine wine has to bring you a pleasure.
It has to bring intense pleasure, I would say. There has to be a sort of intensity of pleasure because, a glass of Jacob's Creek can bring you a lot of pleasure if you haven't drunk wine for a week and you've been out working all day and it's Friday and finally you're over and you come home and all the rest. Absolutely, of course it can. But it wouldn't be a sort of intense pleasure, I think, that something fine can procure you. And that can still be a modest wine.
Yeah, and it has to grasp you. It will take you, as you are, and it will take you on a journey. Because many wines can give you a pleasure, but this thing is, like real fine wine will definitely take you for pleasure. With its stories, with its history, with its geography, with its.
And so it will give you either an intense relationship with the place it came from, or a sense of profundity.
Yeah.
A sense of profundity, which a simple wine doesn't always give you.
Yeah.
There's one question or kind of thought I want to ask you while we are maybe tasting the fine wine number 4. I sometimes think that I'm being too harsh, but for me, wine is closely linked with their people. And when I mean, and usually people say, yeah, of course, but what I mean by this is that when you go and visit these people, and when they are maybe rude or unpleasant, all of a sudden, that wine in the glass does not taste as well anymore for me, or I don't feel, or I don't get the same pleasure that I did before not knowing these people. And you mentioned the story and, like how it kind of all brings us back to the wine. So I wonder whether or not fine wine also has to be about people who are making it and whether or not they are good or bad people essentially as well.
That's quite a daring theory. But I quite like it, actually. And there's no question that wine is always buried deeply into human culture. And there is an individual personal culture of wine, the producer's culture of their own wine, just as there is a sort of national culture of wine and a regional culture of wine. There are many layers of the culture of wine which you can find. And actually, I quite like this idea that there is this sort of cultural relationship with origin and producer.
If this idea is at all true, it is true with fine wine. Because, if you know the producer, if you know the land, if you've been there, it adds a certain additional bonus, which is, what you're having with your wine. And especially in fine wine, yes. if you know, it just adds so much more. And fine wine cannot be about anonymity. It's not anonymous wine. Of course, we're tasting today blind some of the wine, but drinking fine wine, it's like you were meeting an old friend. It's you know where it's coming from. You know what it's supposed to be tasting like. You know what the winemaker maybe is. You know what the region is. So it's like it's a conversation. So if you cannot have a conversation with it, it's probably not a fine wine. And then I completely agree with you. I've had many visits where I do not have a chemical reaction with the winemaker, for example. And in that case, it just doesn't work. You probably will not stock up with their wines, etc. So I'm absolutely fine with this. This side definition of fine wine.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a side definition. It's just I found this with some music that I really enjoyed, and then I watched maybe some interview or podcast listened to podcast with certain people, and they were just being so rude towards the, whoever was interviewing them, and all of a sudden I could not help myself, and I developed that I don't want to listen to that anymore, and I realized that it's also somehow happening with wine.
And sometimes it's not only about being rude or being nice, but if you become friends with winemaker, we were talking about this earlier. It's difficult to be a critic, if you're becoming friends with a winemaker. But if you're talking about pure enjoyment of wines, I want to be friends with the winemaker. It's if I'm not criticizing, I'm not judging or rating their wines, I want to be friends with them. How can I, that's a way I can know them better. That's a way I can. I know how the person feels, how they talk, how they raise their families, what cars they drive, what music they listen to, and it gives an additional edge or additional, kind of a feature to the wine. It's like, I know this guy. The reason his wines taste like this is because he listens to jazz, for instance, or something like this. We discovered this common passion for jazz in Chateau with Thomas Durow. And then his favorite jazz musician is Branford Marsalis, who I happen to be bringing to Riga on the 9th of November. So, talk about the special bond right there. So
Great.
Anyway, I'm not sure you need this for the podcast.
Definitely.
Get your tickets now.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Anyway.
Okay, so the last wine. First thing to say is, don't try and guess what it is.
All right.
You won't get it. You won't get there.
Okay.
This is a wine that nobody will guess. It's a sort of secret, hidden fine wine as far as I'm concerned. It's a wine I was introduced to a few years ago, and I've come back to several times since, and I really like. Obviously, it's a very different style of wine to the other wines that we've been talking about so far. So I'd just love to hear, your reactions as you taste it. As I say, don't try and guess what it is. Just tell me what you think of what you're finding in the glass and how you find it.
Agnes, may I start?
Yeah, sure, you can.
Anyway, to me, Andrew, this has been a long day.
It has been a long day.
We've been tasting, 70, 80 wines today.
And
more
70, 80
more
yesterday.
And more at the end. And now we're drinking wine. So to me, this wine is super calming wine. It's something, after a long and very loud day, I want to sit down and just enjoy slowly this glass of wine. It's really soothing, It's like it makes you just calm down. It's like this is the end of the day, and I'm starting to enjoy everything I've done today. So this is the kind of wine which brings you into this sort of an atmosphere. It's really I don't know what it is, and especially in spite that it's quite young wine. I mean, it's not so very old or not.
It's not 1982.
Exactly.
It's 2015. Actually.
15. All right. Yeah. Okay. So 9 years old wine, but it's in spite of its use, it has the this capacity to really grasp you.
Like this? What do you think?
I actually was also kind of thinking about structure in this wine, and I think when I nosed it, and you kind of have this a lot of fruit, but it is very calm. it is not kind of going up and about and kind of screaming or being very blousy. It's just, it has a lot of fruit, and it just is beautiful there. It just kind of sits and is calm there, which I liked. And then the structure, I love in my red wines tannin. And I think this wine has kind of elevated tannin, but it is very fine, almost, it just kind of covers your palate and is just there like a wave, and then it kind of drops. And I thought that was really beautiful. I kind of have this tannin structure, and kind of like in the scene, you just...
And one thing we might mention there, I mean, obviously, it's quite a ripe wine. I think
yes.
You'll be aware of that. But absolutely, as Agnes says, it has this tannin. And it's important to say that, you know, we're always looking for factors of balance in a wine. Great wines always have a certain inner harmony. But tannin is a factor of balance just as acidity is. This wine actually happens to have both. And I think one of the reasons I like it is because it's a rich wine, but at the same time, a kind of fresh wine.
Yeah.
But in the composition of that freshness, the tannin is playing a role just as the acidity is playing a role. I think that's actually a hallmark of great, serious red wine of the sort we have customarily called fine. You know, tannin is quite important, actually. I think, for example, let's take something very different. This isn't Pinot Noir, but if you think about Pinot Noirs from around the world, so you may have done Pinot Noir tasting with Burgundy against, I don't know, New Zealand, California, Oregon, wherever. I think often the hallmark of the Burgundy is that the quality of the tannins is outstanding and that the tannic presence is palpably there. Certainly true of great Piemontese wine, certainly true of great Tuscan wine, certainly true of great Rhone wines, and certainly true actually of the best wines now from the Southern Hemisphere, from Australia and from Argentina. You get these palpable tannic presences playing a role in the balance of the wine just as acidity plays the role. And wherever acidity is playing too much of a role and tannin doesn't play a role, I think sometimes when we're talking about serious red wine, the interest drops away a little bit. So I do think, I completely agree with you that tannin is a very significant factor, and these actually are beautiful tannins, I think. Well, the other thing I would just ask you is, you know, does it bear scrutiny in the company of the other one? Because you've served us wonderful wines, Aigards, beautiful champagne, absolutely fine Australian Chardonnay, and a wonderful Bordeaux. You know, can you see this wine in the same kind of category, or is it not quite there yet? I don't know. I'm just interested.
You want to start?
Yeah, no, I do. And for me, one of the quality factors which I usually consider when I talk about wine in general is the structure. And I really like the structure here. As I mentioned, like, it just, when I close my eyes, it just looks like sea. You know, you have these kind of beautiful waves, and it is calm in a way. It's not very kind of spiky, and it just has that presence and length and kind of weight on the palate.
And, you know, it's 2015 and it still comes across as quite young. I'm very confident this will age further.
It seems very, very young, yeah.
Yeah.
And since this is the last wine, the last blind wine we're tasting tonight, it's important for the last wine of the tasting or of the dinner to make a statement. You know, it's it cannot be a weak wine. It cannot be a wine that just, you know, flies away and nobody remembers it. This leaves a very lengthy aftertaste, I think, and it gives a, you know, kind of a great ending to this conversation, to this show. So it is completely in line with the wines, and I'd say it complements the company, and it's
right.
absolutely, yeah.
So shall I tell you where it comes from?
Absolutely, go ahead.
It comes from Syria.
Syria,
Oh.
right?
It comes from Syria.
Uh-huh.
It's grown 900 meters up on limestone soils, and it's called Chateau Bargylus. Bargylus is the ancient name of the mountain on which it's grown. It has a different name now. It's a wine that's been made. I won't begin to describe the difficulties the producers have had to make this wine. The producers themselves haven't been able to visit the vineyard since 2011. So they're entirely relying on their workers that are in place, who've had problems with ISIS, who've had problems with civil war, who've had problems with earthquakes. I mean, you name it, they've had the problem. It's incredible. It's really been a wine completely made against the odds.
So,
And actually, I think it's really outstanding wine. And, this is a place where wine used to be made in ancient times.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there is a cultural thread going back 1,000 years or more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's very special wine.
Yeah.
And perhaps also, I should add that the family that's made it, the Sardet family, has made it with the help of Stéphane de Renoncourt, who I think is a very fine Bordeaux consultant.
Yeah.
And I think the advice he's given them has been very sage advice. But the end result is a complete triumph, and not enough people know about this wine yet. So I'm very happy to share it with you tonight.
Thank you.
Sure. So
Thank you
we've
for
just
sharing.
expanded back the definition of fine wine to Syria, so that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, it shows that
Yeah.
wine can come from places where you would not expect, but if everything is right, it's fine. It's fine.
It's very interesting. And actually, before you were saying Syria, my initial modest guess was that, so this is something like Domaine de Trebillon, which has like 50% Syrah, 50%.
Well, I didn't mention the blend.
Yeah,
You're
okay.
absolutely
All
right.
right, okay.
Well done, because the blend here is 60% Syrah, 40% Cabernet and Merlot.
All right, it's a Domaine de Trebillon.
Yeah. So that's which is a sort of forbidden blend for France,
Yeah.
even though there was a
Yeah,
historical precedent, but which is a great classic brand at least the Cabernet's Syrah bit in Australia. So, yeah. But don't
Thank you very much for this treat. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's-
beautiful.
It was my first Syrian wine
I was
and my
also going
first
to say
Syrian
that.
fine wine.
Yeah.
May there be many more.
Yeah,
Yeah, there you go.
definitely.
Cheers. Yeah.
Cheers.